The first of two scripture lessons this morning comes from the Old Testament, from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, verses 31 to 34. That can be found on page 735 of the Old Testament in the Pew Bible. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, says the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No longer shall they teach one another or say to each other, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. The second reading is from Romans, chapter 3, verses 19 to 28. But now, irrespective of law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed and is attested by the law and the prophets. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. They are now justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. He did this to show his righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over the sins previously committed. It was to prove at the present time that he himself is righteous, and he justifies the end who has faith in Jesus. Then what becomes of boasting? It is excluded. By what law? By that of works? No, but the law of faith. For we hold that a person is justified by faith apart from works prescribed by the law. Please join me in the Psalter, page 841 of the hymnal, and this will be done in two parts. Blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord.
Blessed are those who keep God's testimonies, who seek God with their whole heart.
Who also do no wrong, but walk in God's way.
You have commanded your precepts to be kept diligently.
Oh, that my ways may be steadfast in keeping your statutes.
Then I shall not be put to shame, and may my eyes fix on all your commandments.
I will praise you with an upright heart when I learn your righteous ordinances.
I will observe your statutes, oh, forsake me not utterly.
Righteous are you, O Lord, and right are your judgments.
You have appointed your testimonies in righteousness and in all faithfulness.
My zeal consumes me because my foe forget your words.
Your promise is well tried, and your servant loves it.
I am small and despised, yet I do not forget your precepts.
Your righteousness is righteous forever, and your law is true.
Trouble and anguish have come upon me, but your commandments are my delight.
Your testimonies are righteous forever. You give me understanding that I may live.
Please rise as you are able and join me as I read the gospel lesson. The gospel lesson comes from John chapter 8, verses 31 to 36, found on page 101 of the New Testament in the Pew Bible. Then Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The Son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are descendants of Abraham, yet you look for an opportunity to kill me, because there is no place in you for my word." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
499 years ago tomorrow, a Catholic priest shared with his superiors some of his concerns about the faith. Among the concerns he shared was a concern that the Pope had a great deal of wealth, and yet the Pope was choosing to use the money that had been gained from indulgences by the poor to build a new basilica. And none of the Pope's money went towards that task. This young priest was frustrated and made it known. Tradition tells us that he posted these grievances on the door of Wittenberg Chapel in Germany. We know for sure that he shared them with his superior. That priest's name was Martin Luther. And as is often the case when we talk about reform, the powers to be said, "Not interested." And thus, the Protestant Reformation began. You and I were here today in part because of Martin Luther and his willingness to stand up and speak reform, speak change. You know, that is part of who we are. The reality is we all go through reform on a regular basis. We go through change. I thought about this week as I was preparing for today, all the change I've gone through in 38 and a half years of ordained ministry. I still remember that first Sunday at Mount Pleasant United Methodist Church. It was the first Sunday in June 1978. I remember standing up in that pulpit. My sermon had been written, typed out. No computers then, it was a typewriter. Typed out. My prayer was typed out. And I stood in that pulpit the entire time, reading. Now, I will tell you, I didn't read like this and nobody saw me. I made eye contact, but I read it. I read from the manuscript. Today, 38 and a half years later, unless there's some kind of magic trick going on, I don't see any teleprompters. I'm not reading from my manuscript, although I still write a manuscript. If you would ever read it, you would realize that it doesn't sound a whole lot like what I say, because it's still fine-tuned and reshaped and reformed throughout the week. My point is, I'm not the person I was 38 and a half years ago. I've changed. I've reformed. And I'm not alone. I don't think anyone in this room is the person you were 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years ago. We change. We are different. Maybe our beliefs are different. Maybe our attitudes are different. Maybe our political interests are different, but we change. We are reshaped. We are reformed each and every day. And we are benefactors of that change. Look at the world around us and see the change that takes place. I've asked him at the first two services, how many of you would like to go back to the good old days? 1970, let's say. Now, that's good old days for me. 1970, but we're going to do this in a medical way. If you have doctors today, you don't want those doctors. You don't want those new tests that they can give you. You don't want those new diagnoses they've discovered since 1970, because we're going back to the good old days where you do doctoring the way they did in 1970. Doctor might even come to your house to see you. But if you have a heart condition, you can't take advantage of the new medicine today. How many of you would like to do that? Go back to those good old days medically. Why? Because we want the new advances. And they're happening all the time. I can remember in the early 1980s, I was serving in West Virginia. And there was a gentleman in the congregation who was in his mid to late 40s who had a heart attack. And that heart attack was so severe that on 3 different occasions in the emergency room, they had to bring out the paddles to start the heart beating again. This was around 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and his family was told, we're not sure he's going to make it through the night. The next morning, about 6 o'clock, the doctor came out and said, it looks like he's going to be okay. But then the doctor said, if this had happened 6 months ago, we would have lost him. There have been new medications coming out in the last 6 months that have enabled us to keep his heart beating and are going to enable him to live a happy and fulfilling life. You see, change happens, and it's good. Change and reform take place all the time. I remember about a month ago, I was having a conversation on Facebook with a friend. My friend was very agitated, very upset, because his friend had just heard on the news that Congressman Elijah Cummings was going to meet with the leaders of Baltimore City and the leaders of the Baltimore City Police Department to talk about reform. And my friend said, why? Why do they need to be reformed? Why is it that it's always them that need to be reformed? And just went off on this rant. And I responded and I said, reform happens all the time. I shared with her some of the things I shared with you about how reform takes place in our own lives on a personal level. Reform is not bad. In fact, reform is good. Because times change, peoples change, the way we do things changes. The way I do ministry today is much different from what I did in 1978. And that's a good thing. Reform happens. Jeremiah was talking about what the Lord had laid upon his heart. And what God was saying was, there's a new day coming, folks, when my law is not going to be something that you do because I expect you to. When my law is not something you are going to obey because you are supposed to obey. There's a new day coming when you are going to live by the law because it's going to flow from within you. The words are going to be written on your hearts. Indeed, that happens to us when we grow up, isn't it? As a kid, you do certain things because mom and dad tell you you got to do it. And sometimes you don't like it, but you do it anyway. But then as you get older, you begin to understand, yeah, that makes sense. And you don't do it because you know it's good for you and you know it's what you're supposed to do. And you live by those rules for a new reason, because they're written upon your heart. That's what the Lord is telling Jeremiah. Jesus came to this earth, and contrary to what some Christians believe, he didn't come to this earth to establish the Christian church. Jesus came to this earth to reform the community of faith. You know, there are a lot of people out there that believe that Jesus was the first Christian and that he was a devout Christian. But in reality, Jesus was a devout Jew. I have a colleague of mine that actually got in trouble for saying that one time. But it's the truth. Jesus was of the Jewish faith, and he wanted to see that faith reformed. But the power structure didn't want to reform. They wanted to keep it the way it was. Hence, the church was born. Folks, reform is all around us. Change is all around us. It's an everyday occurrence. And it's not bad. It's good. Catherine told me the other day about something she saw where a group of people, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but there was a group of people that were asked, how many of you believe change needs to happen? And everybody raised their hand. And then they said, how many of you are willing to change? And guess how many raised their hands? You see, we don't like change when it happens to us, and yet it does all the time. I'm not the little boy I was 60 years ago. I've put on a few more pounds, I've grown a few more inches, and I eat better food today than I did back then, because it doesn't come out of a can, a little jar. You see, times change, and that's good. And that is who we are called to be. On this day, when we remember Martin Luther and the courage it took to air those grievances, we are reminded that we are called to be change agents, to talk about how our lives have been changed and shaped and molded by God's grace through Jesus Christ. It's our task. It's our mission. It's who we're called to be. Amen.